something I think you like.
Occasionally, I start playing a newly released game, and I know within the first 30 minutes or so that it will be an all-time favorite for me. One that I'll come back to for years to come when I get fed up with whatever modern games are doing at the time. On that list for me are games like Metroid Dread, Titanfall 2, Halo 3, and Shovel Knight. The Resident Evil 4 remake made its way onto that list within the first 15 minutes, and after multiple playthroughs, I know that it's on that list for good. Resident Evil 4 was released as a GameCube exclusive in 2005 as part of the Capcom 5, an initiative from Capcom to release 5 original games on the GameCube, 3 of which released on the PS2 either a few months later or day and date with the GameCube version, and 1 that never released at all. Resident Evil 4 was in development for roughly 5 years, and through that we got the first Devil May Cry once Shinji Mikami decided it had strayed too far from Resident Evil, but the action focus stayed. The game that eventually released was an attempt to take the horror gameplay and setting of Resident Evil and make it even more action-focused than it already was. Part of developing this action focus involved building the basic camera perspective and control scheme that essentially every third-person action game after it would use. Without Resident Evil 4, we don't have Dead Space, Gears of War, The Last of Us, or the camera and control scheme used in Grand Theft Auto 4. It's safe to say that Resident Evil 4 had an immense influence on games in general, so remaking a game like this would be daunting to say the least. You would need to bring it up to modern standards technologically without losing what made people love this game in the first place. When I first heard that a remake of RE4 was coming, I'll admit I was skeptical. Despite loving the RE2 remake, I wasn't certain that Capcom would leave enough of RE4's original goofiness intact. The remakes of 2 and 3 are darker in tone and are also distant departures from the original, acting more like brand new games that take place within the same story and setting as the originals. My skepticism also came from the fact that RE4 has aged incredibly well for a GameCube exclusive from 2005. It plays similarly enough to modern games because of the influence it's had on so many games after it. Basically, I would argue that it didn't need a remake in the same way that RE2 and 3 needed remakes. Thankfully, I was totally wrong. The one-liners and roundhouse kicks from the original are present and then some. The tone is a bit darker, aided by the much more detailed modern visuals and flashbacks to Leon's traumatic experiences in Raccoon City. But it retains the carefully balanced horror/cheesy action vibe of the original. With that, the vast majority of the script is completely reworked, and for the better, I would add. The original script had occasionally awkward wording or jokes that I've just never been a huge fan of. The ballistics line is funny, but I can't help but feel glad that it was left behind. There's so much more dialogue now because the characters can speak to each other during gameplay. I can't help but smile and shake my head at everything this absolute Sigma says.
Jumping across chandeliers, seriously, who does that?
What are you, my mother? Wait here.
What? Okay.
The gameplay here feels both totally fresh and totally faithful at the same time. Your basic objectives and the moment-to-moment combat are the same. Stagger enemies to initiate wrestling moves, and force enemies to group up to take advantage of area of effect attacks with shotguns and explosives. As a result of the nearly perfect character control in RE Engine games, and the wealth of new options you have to deal with threats, Capcom could afford to make the enemies far more aggressive. Simple ideas like the way that Leon leans into a sprint, allowing you to dodge enemy attacks in totally new ways, or even brand new revolutionary tactics such as the ability to strafe or move while aiming a weapon. Nearly every action is attached to an extremely satisfying blend of animations, the powerful but manageable recoil of weapons, or the way that certain combat actions change slightly based on precisely how far away an enemy is. Somehow, roundhouse kicking a crowd of Ganados looks more believable despite the absurdity of the action itself, but also more impactful than before because of how much more precisely the animation of the attack lines up with its effects. Parrying is an absolutely buck-wild addition to RE4 that slots in so perfectly that it's hard to believe that you couldn't do this in the original. It gives your knives a utility that they never really had before. You can now block and parry virtually every attack in the game, including those from thrown axes, molotovs, and chainsaws. Absolutely, transcendentally excellent.
Sorry, you're not my type.
The sparks that fly and the sound that plays when you successfully parry a blow convey, in that way that games not made by From Software rarely do, that you've done something right and probably gained the upper hand in a fight. Being able to then follow that up with a classic roundhouse kick is both a stylish and brilliantly economical way to deal with the threat. Now, early on, I heard some disappointment online at the lack of classic merchant lines, and I have to ask if those people even played the game. I'm still kind of seeing these. He definitely says,
Ooh, what you buying?
but just not like every single time. Now, to me, the more interesting thing about the merchant in the remake is Ashley's apparent acknowledgement of his existence. If you wanted to go all 9th grade English on it, you could have made the argument that the merchant, an inarguably fantastical element, is a figment of Leon's parasite-addled mind. In the remake, though, I had a moment where I had just grabbed a particularly valuable piece of treasure and began my trek back to the merchant to sell it. But I was just holding that run button down and I slightly overshot the door to the merchant, and as I did, Ashley said,
You gonna sell that thing you got?
There's something kind of bizarre about Ashley saying that, right? I mean, our explicit objective throughout the game is to get her out of here as soon as possible, but she is aware of and kind of helping out with the entirely unrelated side activities. It's so strange seeing the characters acknowledging the more video gamey elements like that, but in a way that doesn't really break the fourth wall. It's kind of more implying that these elements are just part of the fictional world of the game, even though they're elements that only exist to facilitate gameplay interactions. Rather than try to contextualize these elements and make them make more sense in a grounded universe, Capcom kind of leans in and directly calls out how absurd this is. I could see this turning some people off, but I love this so much. I had to pause the game the first time this happened and laugh at how ridiculous it was. Now here's the thing. This remake could never have been as much of a departure from the original as the remakes of RE2 and 3 were, as those were remade to function more like RE4 in a way. So instead, they attempted to modernize and expand on the original rather than completely reimagine. Anything that you might have considered half-baked in the original is fleshed out and expanded upon here. Side quests as a concept barely existed in the original, but the remake uses them to get you to explore the areas at your own pace. The levels in this game are so well put together in general. The original contained the basic foundations that the remake builds upon, but now not only is each one of the 3 main areas more dynamic as you progress through them, but also almost entirely retraversable once you've gone through it once. Not completely, you'll still run into some areas that you can't get back to once you leave, and the game doesn't always tell you when that's going to happen. Right before the end of each major area, though, the merchant will mention that you may not be able to come back here once you go any further, and that this is your opportunity to take care of any unfinished business here. There's also typically 1 or 2 new side quests to pick up at this point, like optional bosses or finding particular hidden items. You can actually save yourself some time on repeat playthroughs by picking up these items before you actually find the request, and it all just kind of works. And the way that side quests direct you around each area feels a bit like the player-directed treks across the RPD station in the RE2 remake, and I don't think that's unintentional at all. Your general path through this game is completely reworked from the original. The iconic areas are all here, especially in the early village sections, but your path through the world is almost unrecognizable. Like, you wouldn't have RE4 without Waterhall, but the way that you get there and what happens after is almost entirely new content. I really enjoyed the feeling of saying to myself, oh, I'm here, when entering a familiar area after a while of traversing totally new paths. Even something as simple as collecting and selling gems from the original game is turned into a minor puzzle minigame where you try to get the most out of each treasure by slotting gems into them in different combinations. You can still just straight up sell the gems, but they no longer exist only as money with extra steps. Something the original does that I've never been a huge fan of. I like when items and resources in games have more than a superficial distinction, and giving the gems this utility keeps them interesting to pick up in a way that they just weren't before.
Whoa! God damn, you're a big boy.
Story-wise, I won't go into too much. Safe to say that I like pretty much all of the changes, but in specific, Luis as a character is, like, entirely improved. This is really the major narrative change that I like the most, and it's not just the ballistics line. It's establishing a connection to Umbrella early enough that Leon can have an arc with his relationship with Luis. After they meet for the first time, Leon learns about Luis's past as a researcher for Umbrella and is immediately distrustful of him, but grows to trust him more as they spend more time together. It's not exactly the most groundbreaking of story elements, but it adds so much to the game that was just completely absent from the original. The pacing of this game as a whole is stellar. You quickly move between story sections and combat encounters, but with enough quiet time in between to both build tension and allow you to catch your breath. The only part that I can say that I definitely don't like from the original game is the lab section with the regenerators. Those enemies are theoretically an interesting twist on the combat so far, but I've always just found them frustrating and tedious to deal with. The labs and the enemies within haven't changed that much, but I found myself breezing through that area in a way that I never could before. Part of what keeps the general pacing and flow of the game so good is the tight control the developers have on your resources. On hardcore, you're never really stocked up, but your level of resource poverty does fluctuate in a way that, as I can confirm for multiple playthroughs, has to be intentional. The example I really want to bring up is right after you kill Salazar and take your last steps in the castle. Oh, I'm sorry, is that a spoiler that you fight this dude? Really? This guy? You didn't think there would be a big fight with this guy at some point after the first time he opened his mouth? Anyway, his fight is going to be a major resource drain, which comes after a set piece that also will significantly drain you of resources. You're basically guaranteed to not have too much on you at this point. The only enemies the game makes you fight on your way out are these armor enemies. Armors are by no means the weakest guys in the castle, especially the specific variant that you'll see here on hardcore. Despite how draining that Salazar fight can be, you likely have at least one knife and a flash grenade or two on you. These are two items that you won't use very much, if at all, during the boss fight. If you've mastered fighting these enemies by now, you'll know that these are the only two tools that you need to take these guys down. By now, you may have figured out that you can parry most of their sword swings, and that parrying almost always sets them up to be kicked, and that kicking them makes them vulnerable to a kill from a flashbang. Basically, if you figured all this out from fighting armors in the castle, you know you can take these enemies out without firing a shot. This is brilliant and effective enemy placement. Something else of note with level design is there's a few sections that almost exclusively exist to deliver the solution to a particular puzzle. If you happen to remember the solution from a previous run-through, you can just input the solution and the game accepts it without making you walk back and forth from the clue telling you what to do. I always really appreciate this in games, not arbitrarily locking a puzzle just because technically the character hasn't seen the solution yet. It makes less sense in context, but there's something satisfying about skipping parts of the game based on your memory instead of the character having to learn information that you may already know before you can progress. Okay, I didn't know where to put this in the video, but somebody, or more likely several somebodies at Capcom, love animating little mechanisms. I really enjoy how satisfying unlocking doors and cabinets is in modern RE games. These deadbolts are everywhere, and watching them slide into place scratches a part of my brain in just the best way. The snappy animation and sound effects of these first-person unlocking sequences aren't new to the RE4 remake, but I'm so glad they've persisted since at least the RE2 remake. This also extends to the guns in the game. There's so much detail in how these are animated that it almost makes me wish there was a first-person mode just so we could see these details up close. Now, my first playthrough of this game was done on hardcore, which is pretty unlike me. Typically, I'll go for like the second hardest difficulty option available when I'm playing a new game. But the RE4 remake only describes the difficulty options as for those who have not played RE4 2005 and for those familiar with RE4 2005. So I picked hardcore based on that. The first few chapters were brutal, and after the quarry fight, I was about ready to start over on standard, but something in me made me go a bit further. It really clicked for me in either chapter 3 or 4 of that playthrough, and I was suddenly having way less trouble than before. I think around then is when I was able to properly get a feel for the stakes of every combat encounter, and the degree to which I would have to think ahead every time I spent any of my money. Standard mode is probably still what I would recommend starting with, if for no other reason than the shop prices being much cheaper, but hardcore was an incredibly fun experience. That mode really forces you to interact with every option you have in combat and get a better grasp on the most resource-efficient ways to deal with threats, most of which end up being the most fun and interesting anyway. Something I have to continually praise Capcom for is being able to somehow regularly release games that look like AAA prestige game-styled games, but ones that contain more of a mechanics focus and tighter character control system than those tend to. What I mean is Capcom's games are typically much more mechanically driven than narratively driven, which is not to say that they don't have enjoyable narratives, but more that they understand that the thing that will get you to put 100 hours into a 15-hour single-player game is building gameplay systems that don't stop being fun once you've seen the credits roll once. Essentially, these elements keep RE4's remake from feeling disposable.
Believe me, I know!
Most people talking about this game seem to mention that the first thing they wanted to do after rolling credits was start it back up again. I'm still having trouble putting it down. I'm writing this while my hardcore New Game Plus run is paused in the background. Man, the RE4 remake just feels like a video game, you know? Linear levels with side activities like shoot the targets or collect these gems, the ability to buy character upgrades that aren't loot-based, nor are they Modern Warfare-style gun attachments. There's no rotating weekly cash shops or daily quests or battle passes to keep you playing in the hopes that you'll spend more if you feel compelled to play more. It's just kind of nice, you know? I don't universally hate all of those things, but I like how we are still somehow able to get big budget, high quality releases that don't feel the need to shoehorn those in to try to squeeze some more blood from that stone. I really hope this continues. Games this year like the RE4 remake and Hi-Fi Rush, both with an interesting Shinji Mikami connection, really need to be the rule and not the exception. Games with broad but limited scope, made to be a self-contained experience. Not everything needs to aim for that live service model, and I'm so glad that basically none of that got stapled to the RE4 remake in the process. I did want to, at some point, mention the remarkably few technical issues that I had. Unusually for AAA games, nothing really broke on me. From what I could tell, every mechanic that I interacted with was completely functional despite picking the game up on launch day. Something I seldom do because of how many issues AAA games tend to have early on. There were a few areas though, notably the village when you have Ashley with you and the castle courtyard, that performed way worse than anywhere else in the game. A difference of around 20 frames a second for me. Using any scope also tends to cut my frame rate down by about 10 to 15 no matter where I am or what's going on. And these issues can stack. So using a scoped rifle in the village in the rain has resulted in sub 30 frame rates for me more than once. If the entire game ran like that, I definitely would have refunded it, which I only say to say, it's extremely noticeable and I hope Capcom is aware of these issues and is working to fix them. To be fair though, I am running the game on a GTX 1660 and a Steam Deck, but that 1660 is well above the recommended GPU on the Steam page, and the vast majority of the game runs great on those systems. The only other real technical issue that I had, and this is really nitpicking here, is I saw a guy spawn in front of me once. Like I said before, it's remarkable how few technical issues I was able to run into, but I really hope someone is working on the fixes for what I did see.
You are nothing Mr. Kennedy. So don't get too carried away.
The last thing I really want to get into here is the music. While a lot of it isn't exactly what I'll be listening to in the car from now on, it's all really effective at heightening the mood of whatever sequence it accompanies. Boss fights are all given appropriate weight by their themes, and the stinger that plays when a Garador hears you pierces through the mix and is scarier than the creatures themselves. The tracks that accompany combat are generally high energy and keep up with the pace of the combat really well. But even as they veer closer to straight-up action movie music with loud percussion and fast staccato strings, they never totally let you forget that you're playing a horror game by adding high-pitched squealing strings or unconventional, unnerving horns on top of the standard action movie fare. Now, everyone in the world has talked about Resident Evil save screen music, I know, but this is another great entry in Resident Evil games with fantastic save screen music. Just like the rest of them, this one does a great job of letting you rest a minute in the save screen without totally letting go of the tension and foreboding atmosphere that the rest of the game can carry. And of course, I can't not talk about the shooting range music. The shooting range's existence is already so weird within context, but the high-energy flamenco guitar and brass contrast really well with the dark atmosphere of the rest of the game. It helps that the bonus time section of the track is an absolute jam. Hey gang, I know this is now the second time I've snuck in a Fortnite clip hoping you wouldn't notice, and I was just going to leave it as a dumb visual gag, but while I was writing this, I realized there's actually a lot more interesting stuff to talk about with Leon's presence in that game than I thought. Okay, so we have to agree that RE4 2005 is almost entirely responsible for the camera perspective and basic control scheme of almost every third-person action game that came after it. Even the new God of War games use an over-the-shoulder perspective very reminiscent of RE4. We also have to agree that Fortnite is the most popular third-person shooter out there right now. I don't think that's very controversial to say. Now, RE4 was in the elevator pitch for games like Dead Space by Visceral Games and Gears of War by Epic Games. When Epic wanted to make a shooter that would work well on console as opposed to PC, where their experience almost exclusively was at the time, they borrowed heavily from RE4 to create the basis for their camera perspective and control scheme. Now, obviously Gears doesn't play exactly like RE4, but I'm sure you get what I'm saying here. Epic was still releasing Gears games when they began work on Fortnite, which means the core of Fortnite is based on a game that borrowed from RE4 initially. It's not like there's any mention of this within Fortnite though. It's pretty transparently the same kind of cynical corporate collaborative marketing that all Fortnite crossover characters are, but Leon's inclusion in that game just feels appropriate because of that. I mean, putting this footage side by side, the similarities are pretty striking. And while you could say that of a lot of Fortnite's crossover characters, it's really cool to be playing the current biggest game that uses a descendant of RE4's innovations as Leon Kennedy, even if they did somehow forget to give him the jacket. This is a fantastic remake of a legendary game. I can see some still preferring the original, as this is a lot more than a simple graphics upgrade, but I think very few would argue that this new game is wholly or mostly worse than the GameCube original. The pacing rivals that of Half-Life 2, so its relatively long runtime for an RE game feels like the blink of an eye. Almost all of the performances from the actors maintain the same serious horror versus cheesy action tone balance as the gameplay. Every major area is fun to traverse, and each one is designed well enough that they loop back on each other in interesting ways for collectible hunting and optional exploration. This is an all-time favorite for me, and one that I will not stop recommending to anyone who asks, and as many people as I can find who don't. It does make me wonder if they're planning an RE5 remake, considering that game was Capcom's best-selling game of all time until Monster Hunter World topped it. The issues I would see there are that RE5 is not nearly as fondly remembered as the first 4 games in the series, and that, I mean, if they do 5, they're kind of locked in to do 6 because of how similar those games are. RE5 might actually be a great game to remake though. Mediocre games so rarely get a second chance, and that game's sales might be enough of a justification for Capcom execs to greenlight a remake. I mean, they already may have at this point. I would play a co-op game that plays similarly enough to the RE4 remake, and I would wager many others feel the same. It's probably going to be a while before we know anything about that though, and I've got my next few playthroughs of RE4 already planned out.